section from the 42nd chapter, Surah Ash-Shura, and we had talked about the importance of having hope as a community, and that Allah Ta'ala says, هُوَ الَّذِي يُنزِلُ الْغَيْثَ مِن بَعْدِ مَا قَنَطُوا, that He is the one that sends the relieving rain. He's the one that will bring relief after some people already thought that all hope was lost. And then it says, وَيَنْشُرُ رَحْمَتَهُ, and that He also will send down His mercy. So it is a lesson for and a reminder for us to not despair about the mercy and the hope of Allah. But I kind of want to continue on this track. So how is it that we can, now that we know that we shouldn't despair, what are some of the ways that we can help one another in this effort to be more upbeat and to be more positive? Because despite the ups and downs of life, and certainly we could say that the Prophet ﷺ was more tested in some ways than many or most of us, and from one perspective, and certainly more than all of us from another. If we just think about the fact that this was somebody who lost his parents, he lost many loved ones, he had to bury wives and children, and we sometimes forget even his uncle Hamza. We forget Hamza was more like a big brother because they were just a few years apart than they were technically uncle and nephew. Matter of fact, they were weaned together. And in the tradition of the Arabs, when you're weaned together, really, this is like you become bonded in a way that's such that even as the Quran says that you are no longer, you don't need a mahram between the two of you. So even in the death of Hamza, this was a heavy toll on the heart of the Prophet ﷺ, and yet he had overall a very positive outlook on life, and he was able to put his sorrows, as we would say, in context or in a container, and they didn't become to rule him. But for us, we don't, we're different obviously than the Prophet ﷺ. We don't have Quran being sent down specifically to tell us that Jannah is promised for us, and of how we can try to achieve some of these goals, talking about just one of them, hope today. And as we'll notice, if you read the Quran closely, the way that Allah Ta'ala talks to the human being, the way that He talks even to the believers, is mainly on rectifying ourselves individually, that we also work on being a part of a group. That the Muslims, as we know, the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Muslimu akhu Muslim, right? That the Muslim is the sibling, the brother or sister of another Muslim. La yudlimuhu wa la yuslimuhu, right? That neither we oppress one another, nor do we abandon and leave each other alone to abandonment and to despair. And I want to relate briefly, because I know it's warm in here today, so I'll try to make it a little bit shorter. I want to relate one interesting hadith that Imam Malik, in his collection of hadith al-Muwatta, he chose to include it, and some other scholars have noted that it's mursal, but they still include it because of the how it is generally in agreement with the Sunnah. Sallam is stated to have said, "Ash-shaytan yahummu bil-wahid wal-ithnain." That the Prophet ﷺ said, what shaitan is interested in the individual and in like the duo, right? Two people. Bil-wahid wal-ithnain. فَإِذَا كَانُوا لَمْ يَهُمَّ بِهِمْ, right? That in the case though, however, there's three or more, then shaitan doesn't really take an interest. So this gives us an important insight on if we want to develop ourselves in whatever capacity. One, it's not going to be merely the individual effort of any of us. It's not up to some sort of like individual spiritual Olympics to become a pious person or to live a life that Allah Ta'ala will be pleased with. If we think that it's only up to our individual effort, then we're really kidding ourselves. And we actually see this more for those of us that have kids. We see this with the younger generation, where they tend to suffer, particularly today, from isolationism. They're very isolated, and this is when they can become susceptible to anxiety, depression, and other thoughts, because this is who shaitan takes an interest in, is the individual or even just the two people hanging out, right? As we joke sometimes, nothing is more dangerous than two people getting together that have the conclusion that both of them are, as one hadith says, al-firqa najiyah, that they are the saved group and everybody else is somehow astray. It's easier to come to negative thoughts. It's easier to come to self-misguidance when you are by yourself or just with one other person. If you're in a group of at least decently minded people and you say, hey, let's have a drink or let's do drugs or whatever, the majority of the group is going to go, nah, I don't really think that's such a great idea. And therefore, it's harder for us to be persuaded to disobey Allah. It's harder for us to be persuaded as a group to be misguided, because there's always going to be the collective genius in the group. We see this in certain animals, particularly those that Allah Ta'ala talks about in the Quran. One is the bee that he says, وَأَوْحَيْنَا. Right? He says the bee is inspired. Now the bee is just a simple, silly little insect. But as a group, under the direction of their queen, they're able to do things that really, quite honestly, baffle us. Right? They're the only insect, or one of the very few insects, that actually makes architecture. Right, and they do so in a very complicated, the octagon shape, this 8-sided shape that they make of the honeycomb. This is something that comes from the inspiration of Allah, but it manifests in the hive, meaning in the collective. The same thing with the ant. The ant is also a very amazing little creature, but by itself, and scientists have studied this, by themselves, ants seem to have very little direction when they're left alone and isolated. But when they are part of a collective group, they're incredibly efficient, and they do things that, again, how does something that has the brain the size of a grain of sand or even smaller, how is it doing these things? There is barakah that comes from being part of a group. So this is one of the reasons why we actually tend to be happier in the month of Ramadan. Because it's not only just because the month is a blessed month, and it's not just simply because we're fasting and the endorphins are being released, but it's because we're actually enjoying each other's this same basic outlook on life. Some of us may be more liberal, more conservative. Some of us may be Sufi, Salafi, Hanafi, Maliki. But at the end of the day, we all believe La ilaha illallah, Muhammad abduhu wa rasuluhu. And when we come together in that group collective, we all tend to feel better. I do apologize. They're doing some, apparently, fire testing. The fire department is here today, so I'll try to speak over it as much as I can. So recognize that it's not a personal Olympics, that all of us will need help. Matter of fact, the Olympian is the perfect example. People that go to the Olympics, we only watch them when they perform. We're not seeing them with their trainer, with their coach, all the other people that are helping them on the way. We only see the 30 or 60 seconds of them performing, right? But nobody becomes an Olympic athlete by themselves. They require aid and assistance, and most of them are on a team, and their teammates are encouraging and then pushing them to go beyond their limits or be the best that they can be. And in the same way, this is how we see. So Allah Ta'ala actually shows us this in other ayat. For instance, he says, وَالَّذِينَ يَجْتَنِبُونَ كَبَائِرَ الْإِثْمِ وَالْفَوَاحِشِ. Those that do their best to avoid the major sins and those things that are repugnant, right? So one, it says what? وَالَّذِينَ, the group. It's going to be a lot easier for me and a lot easier for you to avoid major sins. We're all going to make minor sins and mistakes, but the big things, you will help keep me in line, and vice versa. I can help keep you in line. We can be a source of encouragement for one another. And this is how the Quran wants the human being to live, with love and encouragement for each other. As we said in a few ayat before this, a few verses before this, Allah even told the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, قُلْ لَا أَسْأَلُكُمْ عَلَيْهِ أَجْرًا إِلَّا الْمَوَدَّةَ فِي الْقُرْبَى. Say to the people, I don't even ask you for any reward other than you will what? Love your own kith and kin, your own family, that you will be more loving and compassionate for them. Again, the group. And then he continues by saying in this group, وَإِذَا مَا غَضَبُوا هُمْ يَغْفِرُونَ. Now, we often think about forgiveness as what we ask from Allah. And it's true. We ask Allah to forgive us for our sins, and may Allah Ta'ala indeed forgive us for our sins. Ameen. But Allah Ta'ala is also saying that amongst the believers, right, when they become angry, which one? Yes, I know many of you say, well, isn't there a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, don't get angry? This is advice. It's impossible that any of us are not actually ever going to become angry, right? But it's an advice, and then the Quran is saying what? When you do become angry, what? You forgive one another. I can't tell you how often I have people come into my office that had an argument with somebody in their family, and they haven't been on speaking terms for decades. Decades. Or they have a friend, well, I went one time to this masjid, or I knew this person, they said something, and that's it. You know, and how are you having a disagreement that's going on for decades? If we want forgiveness from Allah, part of that, then we also have to learn to be forgiving and gentle with one another, and stop having these misconceptions that simply because a person believes in Allah and in the Prophet ﷺ, and because they believe in the last day, and and they believe in the books and the messengers and all these things, and they pray, and maybe they even go to Fajr, and they have all the outwards, signs of being pious, that if they make a mistake or they get angry, that somehow now that they're not really who they are. No, it's just being human. Be tolerant and forgiving of one another, and you will grow in love with one another, and you will want to then spend more time around one another. And when you spend more time around one another, shaitan will take less of an interest in you. But if you allow yourself to essentially, convince yourself, well, it's better to be alone, then that's when shaitan is really going to take an interest in you. And we see this, people that suffer from these kinds of anxieties. This is why, social media and these other things, I mean, I'm on it, I use it, but I have I also study it quite a bit. But they show, why is it that people that use social media, particularly younger people, the more they use it, the more insecure they feel, the more their self-esteem goes down. It gets you alone, and then it starts telling you, you don't have this and you don't have that. You're not beautiful enough, you're too fat, you're too skinny, you're this or that, you don't have this special, item or whatever it is. It only happens when you're alone. But when you're together as a group, you will actually be far more intelligent in a way than you ever could, even if you happen to be a genius, right? I mean, you look at people like Albert Einstein. For all of his genius, he wasn't even sure if there really even was a God. This is because this is somebody that spent a little too much time alone, put a little bit too much stock in their own intelligence, and doesn't also see the guidance of revelation as a necessary component to even the genius that Allah may have indeed gifted them with. But if they are relying upon their own intelligence, they won't even be able to see that there is a creator, let alone La ilaha illallah and Muhammad abduhu wa rasuluhu. So think about this, how coming together, putting aside differences, it can help you to avoid those major things, because when you do commit major sins, then all that does is make you beat up on yourself even more, even though Allah has already said that Allah yaghfiru dhunuba jami'an. Allah says He forgives all sins. But we commit a sin, and when we're by ourselves, God must hate me, doesn't like me, He's never going to forgive me. These are the thoughts that come to you by yourself, that shaitan has taken an interest in you and wants to only make you kind of marinate even in this even further. But the way of the Quran, the guidance of the Quran, and the way of the Prophet ﷺ is to be together and with the group. May Allah Ta'ala make us from the Ahl al-Maghfirah. May Allah Ta'ala make us from the people of forgiveness, wa Ahl al-Taqwa, wa Ahl al-Quran, from the people of piety and also from the people of the Quran. Nasallaha bil-afiyah. We ask Allah for forgiveness, pardon, and well-being. ربنا اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا. استغفر الله استغفر الله استغفر الله. الحمد لله وحده وصلواته وسلامه على رسوله المصطفى وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه وبعد. So I'll leave with this. There's also another hadith that we hear quite a bit. And sometimes, it's obviously there's no problem with the statements of the Prophet ﷺ, but it's how we understand them. So there's a statement in which the Prophet ﷺ said, he said, من حسن إسلام المرء ترك ما لا يعنيه. Right? From the goodness of a person's Islam is to leave that which doesn't concern him. Now, if we understand this in the correct light, it doesn't mean there isn't anything we shouldn't be concerned at all. And this is not a call to be by yourself and don't bother anybody. It just doesn't mean become bothersome, right? It just means don't become nosy. It means don't, be intrusive into people's business, but it doesn't mean don't be part of the group. It doesn't mean don't encourage people to do good. It doesn't mean participate in the group for your own benefit. Sometimes we take these statements and they're taken out of context, and we think that somehow Islam is a religion that requires us to go into the privacy of our own individual lives and try to worship Allah Ta'ala to the best of our ability, and are slowly eaten up inside because Shaitan has taken a very, very keen interest in one of us or the two of us that get together. So if we're going to be amongst those people that don't lose hope and understand that Allah huwa alladhi yunzil al-ghaytha, that Allah is the one that indeed does bring relief. Wa huwa yanshuru al-rahmata, and He is the one that does send down His mercy. It will be a lot easier to understand this in the mind and the heart if we are around each other and like-minded and remind each other to do good, and also remind each other that Allah is also forgiving and forgives all sins. So inshallah, again, we ask Allah Ta'ala to make us from the people of His book, the sunnah of His prophet, and make us from the people that He will forgive in this life, inshallah, in the next wa aqim as-salah.